So, is it true or is it false? Did Black women in America experience homemaking, motherhood, and marriage back in the old days, back in the historical time periods or vintage times? Is it true or is it false? Well, in this video, I'm going to debunk whether or not if it's true or if it's false that Black women were married, homemakers, or housewives and embraced motherhood back in the old days. So stick around to hear more. Hello everyone, thank you so much for tuning in today's video. So I'm going to dive right into this topic. The question remains, were Black women homemakers or housewives or married or mothers back in the old days or in the vintage times or historical time periods? Preferably I would say after slavery, 1865. Is it true or is it false? The answer remains, and it is yes. It's a big fat yes. Yes, Black women experience being married, motherhood, homemaking, and being a housewife. Yes, it's true. Now, I obviously can't say that every single Black woman was a mother or was married, but according to statistics, it proves true. So, Hollywood, mainstream culture, mainstream media, Hollywood TV shows, and these popular shows on these networks, like I would just say Netflix and things like that, they tend to depict the housewife as this upper class, stuffy white woman that had a lot of maids, or she always had a Black woman as like her servant or her maid and things like that. And so I can see the disconnect of how many people would believe by watching these TV shows and movies, and also what modern day politics have to say about back then. Marriage is actually declining tremendously in the Black community. So interestingly, according to a lot of sources that I researched, I've done a lot of research on this topic. It's very fascinating to me. I love researching certain things of history, true history. I love especially reading articles that were written before the 2000s. So I like reading and studying articles from like the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, and early 2000s, like very early, like 2000, 2001. This is because older articles, they give more of an accurate, genuine explanation and study, and also the mainstream public education system and just our modern day culture overall, we tend to block out a lot of things back then. We call things back then conservative or traditional, or it's old-fashioned, it's outdated, things like that. So when we use those kind of words, like even oppressive and stuff like that, when we have that in our heads that something is just a word, we miss the bigger picture of learning more about it. So if you read articles from the 70s and the 80s, even the 60s, surprisingly, you will learn more instead of just learning a word that we tend to just use today in our time period today. But surprisingly, interestingly, Black women were getting married more than white women back then. Yes, if you didn't know this, today's your day. Between 1890 and 1940, 69% of Black women were married, and they were having children in their marriages in wedlock with the same spouse. Having children out of wedlock was not really heard of. In the 1950s, it was roughly the same between white women and Black women. You can see that it was roughly the same. Black women and white women were getting married at the same rate. America calls the 1950s the golden age of marriage. But between 1890 and 1940, an overwhelmingly amount of Black women were married and having children. And that comes with the role of homemaking. For some, I can't obviously say every Black woman was not working or something, part-time or full-time. Obviously, that's the reality of back then. Marriage in the Black community started to decline after the late 1960s and the 1970s. So why the sudden decline after the Civil Rights Movement? After that time period, marriages in the Black community started to decline. So this is why it may seem that there aren't many Black homemakers or Black women who are married today. So here's the thing also, homemaking is not based on skin color. It's not based on a shade of our skin. Marriage and homemaking, being a wife, being a mom, being a husband, being a father is not based on flesh. It's not based on our skin color, hair, eye color, things like that. Homemaking and marriage is a design by God. It's a role that God created. It's a biblical value. When society is close to God, despite any negativity, unfair laws, negative laws, any kind of struggle, or any kind of negative policy that's going on, despite any negativity that's going on within the culture or within the government, God's word still remains the same. It's either accepted or it's rejected. God's word is either accepted or rejected. But despite any of that, marriages will still continue, motherhood will still continue, and homemaking will still continue. This is why a lot of us have a strong admiration for those time periods in history, because we can see that family unit, we can see husband and wife, you can see mother and child and father with son, femininity, masculinity. We see it in marriages. And when we only just stay focused on just one aspect of a time period, like just the fashion and the hairstyles and the cultural things of the time, like Hollywood and actresses and actors and things like that, we leave out the bigger picture. We don't get the narrow end and really see the reality of their lives back then. So also, why there may be a decline with Black homemakers today, and this would be a whole other video on this topic, but I just want to quickly say marriage nowadays is shifting to an alternative. Our modern culture today, you can see how God is being depleted out of our humanity and society today. And with politics ushering in every aspect of life, especially in the Black community, we now accept the different alternatives to marriages. We now accept moving in before married. That's now acceptable. We accept having children out of wedlock. That's acceptable now. But we kind of know that all leads to struggle. Having children out of wedlock, there's a higher struggle. Moving in before married, it's not a stable thing. The decline of Black homemakers and the decline of Black marriages is not necessarily due to skin color. It's due to more of lack of cultural values, good values. It's a lack of having God at the center of the Black community rather than having politics in the center of the Black community. Also, when we study history within the Black community, we tend to just learn the same popular narrative. We learn about racial injustice, white supremacy, oppression, things like that. And like I said earlier, when we learn those words, it kind of stops us short from really learning the actual reality of those time periods. So overall, to conclude in this video, Black women were married back then. I don't know if they're ever going to depict this, but it's a value made by God, along with gender roles, motherhood, fatherhood, the family unit. There were more Black women having children while married, and that's what creates this stable foundation for children. Not to say white women weren't getting married, they were. Now we have to understand how society also changed during those times, how work began to become more accessible to women. It was being promoted more. We need to look at the social things that were happening. More social movements for women to work outside the home, feminism, how that impacted the role for women of all races, of all cultures in America, in the West. We should look at the whole spectrum, the whole picture. Apart from God, we may not understand those values. Overall, that's what happens when we're in a fallen state. When man sinned, sin entered the world. And so despite negative laws and all that, and living in a sinful, fallen state of mankind, God's word will still remain. Blacks were still holding on to their values back then, and you can see a huge difference of how the Black family was back in the old days versus today. Clearly see it. There's been a huge shift. So yes, I do want to see more Black homemakers, of course. I do want to see homemaking in all communities. I want to see how marriage plays out in all communities. It's a beautiful thing that God designed for us. And thanks so much for watching or listening. I really appreciate it. And my name is Beryl Ann, and you can call me Ann for short. I'll see you guys in my next video. Until next time.